Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the travails, difficulties, and challenges of Gen Z, millennials, and really anyone sort of, I suppose, under the age of 40 these days. I think we've all seen the TikTok videos of people, young men and women in their typically in their mid to late 20s, saying, "Look, I still have to live at home with my folks. I can't afford to buy a shitbox apartment somewhere, even in a regional city. I work, 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, and I can't afford squat, and so things are really bad." And particularly when they compare it to the previous sort of generations, and how they could all afford to buy a house and get married, have children, all this sort of stuff. And there's a lot of people who are, so even in their mid 30s, late 30s, who don't own anything at all. They've got everything they own could fit into a couple of suitcases, and they're renting. They can barely afford a car, and even that's a shitbox. And so they look into the future, very uncertain employment. Maybe they've got to work 3 jobs to make the 40 hours, so very uncertain, unstable employment. They look at the future and think, hold on a minute, I'm living the equivalent of, if it was in a farming community, I'm living the equivalent of a fucking hand-to-mouth rural peasant subsistence farming. And where's my future? And it's nothing like the future that my parents or grandparents had. Now, on some level, this is derided as just whinging punk ass kids, they're so fucking lazy. Why are they? If they just get out and work hard, they can turn things around. Or they stayed in university or college for too long, and they've got debts, tuition fee debts and that sort of thing. And this is going to fuck them up. And so they're in a bad place because of their own bad decisions. And so of course they're not going to be able to afford to move out of their folks' house, and they can't even afford to pay rent and so on. So now there's I think there's a lot of validity in what the Gen Zers and the millennials, or again, people under the age of 40 are saying. So I'm going to go over a few things here some of it stating the obvious and maybe some different perspectives. But the people that complain about this, and I'll sort of, just as a quick sidebar here, I was recently asked by the daughter of some people that we know, and she said, "Look, I'm thinking of a number of possible career options. Could you like, you've been around and you've been in business and and in a few months' time I'll turn 61 and all that. So you can sort of give me some pointers here if you would be so kind." So I was, "Sure, I'll help you." So I gave some advice and listened to her perception of the future and how it's going to go and so on. And she's got fairly limited horizons, and she's no genius. But there's a certain sort of sensible, practical sort of element to her, and I think that'll stand her in good stead. But she's I had to tell her, "Look, you've got to get rid of that body piercing. That nose ring just isn't going to cut it." But anyway, just coming back to the sort of the meat of it. The claim that Gen Z are making is that they've got much less chance of like buying a house. And I think is perfectly true. There's no disputing it. There's no, and if you go to a regional city or town where property is cheaper, then the employment opportunities are far, far less than they are in the bigger population centres. Again, obvious. Now, I can go to a rural town, for example. We had a short vacation recently, a rural town, and it's true that what you would have to pay $1 million for in even an outer suburb of Sydney, you can buy for $250,000 in this place. But there's almost no jobs there. So unless you go there with the cash in your pocket to buy a place, if you go there as a normal sort of kid starting out with a mortgage, there's hardly any. Some of the most prized jobs in these places are if you work for a national supermarket or grocery store chain. That's some of the prized jobs. Now, they've got a small nucleus of jobs that are full time in these places, and if you get that job, I mean, you've got, wow, it's gold. That's how far down the value scale it goes there. And I'm aware of people, and as a guy who there, and he works 2 hours a morning cleaning the one of the shopping arcades. Then he goes and does something at one of the fish and chip shops, and then he goes and does it. So he's got like 6 jobs, and he works an hour or so a day at each one of these jobs, and he's forever running back. And he's a pretty fit, active guy, but he's it's all casual employment. They can tell him any day, look, your job's over, your job's finished. But he's in there doing that, and that's the thing he has to do. So he's got pretty much a zero sort of social life, and he's at the beck and call, running back and forth, fetch and carry sort of flunky. That's the position he's in, and those are the only sort of employment opportunities really in a place like that. So just moving to a regional town to get cheaper real estate means you then lose a lot of job opportunities. But coming back to the material point here is that the generation, certainly in modern history, and so we're going from, say, the mid 1700s onwards, the generation that has had the most purchasing power, if this is relative to cost of living, so the most purchasing power, particularly in regard to property, has been the baby boom generation. So starting, say, in, the mid 1950s, maybe a bit earlier in the United States, but the price of property relative to wages was such that somebody working at just a basic job in the factory could afford to buy a basic 3-bedroom house, a basic entry level, General Motors or Ford motor vehicle. They could have a driving vacation once a year, and so you have to support a dependent wife and 2.4 children. Maybe when the children were in high school, she would do some sort of a part-time job somewhere, and that type of thing. So that was the purchasing power of the paycheck back then. And something I've mentioned a million times is the first apartment I rented was $18 a week rent, and that same apartment, which took less than 20% of my cash take-home pay wage, whereas today it's like $460 a week, and that's a one-bedroom, modest one-bedroom apartment, and that if you look at that, it's nearly 50% of the pay today. So 20%. When I was a kid, to 50% of the paycheck is going on rent for exact same apartment. In fact, it's got less now because you don't get the garage with it that I got when I first rented that place as a punk ass kid. So that's the difference there. 20% of your wage on rent or mortgage payments would have been roughly in line, to 50% today. And again, that's a one-bedroom apartment. When you're looking at 2-bedroom apartments, 60, 65, even a mid-range one, 60, 65% of your wage is on rent, or a mortgage payment. So people just can't afford it. Because the price of houses has gone ballistic, then the amount of deposit that you have to save up has also increased. So even someone who worked diligently, and really put their work 7 days a week and saved every penny, live with their folks, they would still struggle to buy an average property, unless they're on an exceptional wage. So the Gen Z are quite right. The purchasing power of the paycheck has gone to shit. But they also need to remember the previous two generations to the one today, assuming a generation's, notionally 25 years. The previous two generations had the best time ever in modern human advanced Western history. They had the best time ever in terms of the purchasing power of the paycheck, being able to buy property. Now, we also need to look at the property and the sort of property. Now, the property I remember around when I was a kid is the 10-foot by 10-foot bedrooms. Now, those bedrooms typically would have two kids, and a lot of families had 3 or 4 kids. So the 10-foot by 10-foot would have 2 people in it, 2 kids in it. And if you put the 2 beds side by side, you had no room for a closet or anything like that. So typically they'd have bunk beds, so one on top of the other, and then they could fit a closet in the room. So many of my friends, certainly when I was younger, they would have to share a bedroom with a brother or a sister, and that was kind of how it was. There was one pretty compact bathroom in the house. There'd be maybe a garage or often a carport for the car, some shed in the backyard, like where you'd have the lawnmower and everything. And so pretty basic stuff. Not many of the houses were brick. A lot of them, what in Australia are called weatherboard. And it's like a masonite type sort of, soft mix sort of concrete sheeting, which would form the exterior cladding of the house. So very basic, very simple, small compact house. I remember the lounge rooms are such that, you have more than 3 or 4 people in it, you almost had to turn sideways to fit into it. So that was a very, very basic. The land typically would have been generous, like 900 square yards or 800 square, somewhere in that vicinity. So a lot of people didn't bother with fences then. The houses were basic, and you'd have an average of 5 people, 6 people living in them, including the kids. Now today, houses are made of bricks and much better quality building materials. They're bigger by a decent amount, say a good 30% bigger than they were back then. Again, better appointments, made of brick, double brick and whatever. So, and there's a much smaller family unit. So, I think it's 3.2 now is the size of a family, assuming the children are there. So everyone's got their own room. There's a spare room, there's a study or something. So there's much more space. And back then, I remember a family of 4 or 5 kids wasn't really that unusual. You'd have to be good at getting on with people. You're packed in like that. But it wasn't, and no one thought they were hard done by at the time. So there's much more expectation today that well, my parents had a big place, so I want a big place, and yet the cost of that is much higher, again in purchasing power terms than it was then. So we've also got bigger houses made of more expensive materials. That needs to be factored into the overall scheme of things. In a lot of places now, certainly in Australia or Sydney at least, those weatherboard type houses that most building codes and so on won't allow those sort of cheap building materials. You've got a minimum standard now, which of course adds to the cost. So just looking at this, the overall sort of scheme of things is bigger houses, more expensive building materials, much more onerous government requirements and building code standards that add to cost. That's not the big decisive element in things though, but it needs to be factored in, and higher expectations as to standard of living. For example, there's some friends of ours. They've got their daughter's in her, what would she be, late 20s, I suppose, and she's kind of refusing to move out and get her own place. She probably could afford, well, she can't afford it. You know, she'd go in together with a couple of girlfriends, but they can't afford the standard of housing and accommodation they want. They want modern kitchen, modern bathroom, modern this. You know, they want the finest appointments. They want so and so and so and so, and they want it to be, you know, in near to a cool, funky shopping centre. They want it to be near shopping strips. They want it to be near public transport for getting to work. You know, they want all the boxes ticked plus some. And so, well, we want all this. We're not prepared to accept anything less, and we can't afford that standard. Therefore, we want, you know, you can all get lost. You can all get fucked. Yeah, we want what we want, and we're not prepared to compromise. And that surprised me, that because when I was, you know, a kid, you accepted what you could afford. You know, that was it. You didn't say, well, I want to stand if I can't have it. But they've got the option of staying with. She's got the option of staying with the folks, as many do at that age. You know, my folks were very much, hey, go and find your own way in the world. You're not staying here. But she can, in her late 20s, she can, and they're not putting pressure on her to move out or to go and find a place. You know, she's not getting any lectures from her parents saying, hey, you got to go and get what you can afford. You may dream of some fancy place and the, you know, the penthouse apartment. You may dream of that, but you can't afford it. But the argument with Gen Z, I've noticed, is, or millennials and Gen Z, is, why can't I afford it? Somehow I'm being oppressed if I can't afford the apartment. I can't afford the penthouse. But the mere fact I can't afford the penthouse means I'm being oppressed. Must be those white supremacists or something. So that they very, very quickly go off into the Marxist arguments of we're being oppressed by. Now, coming to look at a sort of few other things, the reasons why, you know, I pointed, you know, they'll accept and agree that the paycheck today has much less purchasing power than it did in 1970. They accept that. But say, well, it must be something evil caused that to happen. You know, it's the white supremacist, or it's that, and they go into some sort of crazed Marxist bullshit. And when you sit down and try and explain it to them, say, okay, do you think mass migration has had an effect on it? You know, in Australia, there are nearly 6 million people who have been brought into the country in 20 years. You know, don't you think that would have an effect? There's a lot of people looking for houses to buy and places to rent and this sort of thing. Do you think that would force up the price of rents? Yeah, you know, maybe. But you know, I'm not a racist. I'm not a Nazi. No. Putting aside the idea that everyone's a Nazi that questions mass migration, does it have, or will it have an effect on, just simple economics here, will it have an effect on very substantially increasing the demand for housing, you know, rental or buying, and the price of houses? So this was the price of a house in 1990. It was $200,000. That same house today is $2.5 million. Now, wages haven't increased by anywhere near that amount. If you want to rent that place, it's going to cost you X, way more than it would have in 1990. So just compare, you know, when you're looking at the purchasing power of the paycheck being much less, if housing is costing far more than it did, you know, many times more than wage increases, is that a factor? And has that factor been exacerbated at the very least by mass migration? Maybe, but then the government should just build more houses. No. Let's just stick with the cause and effect here. Has mass migration increased the price of housing and rents? So finally they'll accept it, but they're too frightened to accept it, because if they do accept that, then it means that they're Hitler, because only Hitler would draw that conclusion. No, forget about Hitler. It's simple economics. Millions and millions of people are being brought in, and many of those people are looking for accommodation. Even if they live 10 people to a one bedroom or 20 people to a two bedroom, it doesn't matter. There's still many more people that are artificially increasing the demand for property and thus pushing up rents, which means your money, your paycheck doesn't go as far as it otherwise would have. You know, and I point out, when I was a kid looking for places to rent, you places were empty for months at a time waiting for tenants, and you could always cut a deal. I mean, the apartment, the first apartment I rented, it was fully furnished, and when I say fully furnished, it had a fridge and table and like dining room table and chairs. It had a bed frame and other stuff, there. So I really didn't need anything when or a mattress or something. Yeah, but I didn't really need anything when I moved in. And they even had all the hangers in the closet and all that sort of stuff. So the guy said, "Well, do you want? It's $22 a week furnished, $18 unfurnished." Now I had access to some furniture, so I said, "Well, no, I'll have it unfurnished." And the guy says, "Okay, well, someone will come around to collect the furniture, in next week or so." Anyway, no one ever came, so I inquired. So look, that furniture's still there. Yeah, can't be bothered. So I've got to pay someone to pick it up, cost of storage and everything. Look, it's on us. So I got the furniture for free there, but that was the they just threw it in because getting a tenant wasn't that easy. There was more property than there was tenants. Today it's the reverse, particularly in a city. And this girl was telling me she's gone for, again, this is the most prized real estate that everybody wants, sort of inner city, cool and funky, renovated and remodeled and all this sort of stuff. Everybody wants that. And she says they can join a queue of 100 people. And I've seen this. I drove past, and this is in an outer suburban area. I drove past one place that was for rent, it was for rent, and it's for inspection, and it's near near some pretty decent transport links, and I wondered what the fuss was all about. I sort of drove past, and it's just this mass of people. I thought, is it a fire or something? What's going on here? And so I even sort of turned around and came back just to see what the fuss was all about. It was a rental inspection, and there must have been like 50 people there to fucking inspect this property, which was not a fancy property. It was probably at the cheaper end of things. And a lot of the folks standing in line there to do the inspection, they didn't look like they were very well to do. So anyway, that was them. Now, coming back to the Gen Z thing here, why did you go to university to get a sociology degree? It's not worth a pinch of shit. Why did you do that? And you're in debt for $75,000. It's going to take you a lot on the sort of wage that you're getting. It's going to take you a long time to do it. So I pointed out, well, look, you can still pay. What about you work, as a barista or something during the day? Then you can get a night job and a weekend job. You're young enough and fit enough and active enough where you can do that, and then you can have your debt paid off in a couple of years, and then you can sort of get on with your life. You're still living with your folks. And so this is a youngish woman again. Oh no, why should I do that? I want to have a life. I got my friends. We want to go and party. We want to, go and cruise the nightclubs and the bars, and I want some time to myself. Why should I have to do that? And the world's so unfair. If those are the things I have to do, she argues, that means the world is unfair. And why should I participate in such unfairness? Why don't I just wallow in my misery and just do that? So they're not prepared to do this sort of things. Now, should they have to work night and maybe not, but in order to turn the situation around, that's what you need to do. So you either need to not go to university in the first place, especially for some bullshit degree, and nor should you go to university. Now, she might argue that university, well, look how expensive university is, far more expensive than it was when my folks were young, or my grandparents and that sort of thing. So that's unfair. No, and that I do concede. It is unfair, but you've now got a plethora of bullshit degrees. They're indoctrinating with all sorts of fucking bullshit. And then you come out with a debt on a degree that's not worth a pinch of shit anyway. The standard of education that you would get just finishing senior high school in the 1970s was equivalent, if not exceeding, a PhD level education today. Because of rigor, you were passed on a strictly pass or fail basis. You couldn't go from junior high school to senior high school unless you passed. You couldn't go from year 11 senior high school to year 12 unless you were passing. You couldn't get to university unless you were passing the exams. And there were strict cutoff points. There was none of this, have we got enough black lesbians in the intake? There was none of that. You either passed or you didn't. And so the lack of rigor has created a bullshit education system that doesn't deliver anything. So I do agree that they're being ripped off by the education system, but they're not blaming that. They're they're not saying, well, we got ripped off by the education system by a bunch of screaming lefties that are paying multi-million-dollar salaries to black lesbian presidents of the university and so on, and they're not delivering value for the students. They're not going down. They're not talking about mass migration being the cause. They're not talking about the climate change idiocy that's adding to your cost of your gas and electricity and everything else. They're not talking about that. They're just talking about some amorphous white supremacist, the days when evil Hitlers are running everything and this sort of thing. So they're just not addressing the issues. But in the overall, just looking at the purchasing power of the paycheck in 1970 compared to the purchasing power of the paycheck today, then there's something like 70% less purchasing power today than there was then. So it's a big difference. And that money is being primarily chewed up in putting a roof over your head, energy, and more recently, particularly given around the COVID time, food and education. But it's a bullshit education. It's not an education that's rigorously preparing you for some meaningful career. Now, on top of that, the mass migration, particularly of the peasant labour, has caused a lot of depression in wages at the very bottom end, the sort of jobs that kids coming fresh out of high school or college would take. So, that's another, do they appreciate that? And particularly girls sort of, have got a blind spot on this. But they're just human beings who just want to come to America for a better life. Fine, that's fine, okay. But also understand, for every one of those that comes in, your wage is going down or not going up at the rate it should, and your cost of living is going up. So, feel as good as you want to and virtuous as you want to, but remember, you are paying a price for that. Not an upfront price, but a price across the government services you can access, the cost of accommodation and so on. So I agree with Gen Z and so on that it is much tougher for them. That there's no disputing that. But the causes that they see are not the ones that are causing the problem. They just think it's some sort of amorphous dysfunction, a miasma somewhere, and they just can't work out where it's coming from. They just know it's bad. But that's not, they're not looking at the real issues that are causing the problem. But on top of that, they have very high expectations themselves. Like this lady, or she's in her late 20s, daughter of people we know. She's only prepared to move out of her parents' place if she can get the finest, top of the range, penthouse. But she's on the wage of a fucking floor sweeper, and she thinks that's an outrage. Why is a wage on a wage of a floor sweeper? Why can't I afford that apartment? So the sense of reality and the proportionate reality that the Gen Zs apply, many of them, not all, many of them are applying, is also in the insane area. But yet these are the same people that will insist that we're surrounded by Nazis. You've been attached to us today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.